Ladies and gentlemen, welcome along to Too Many Games, and today we continue in our video series on Epic Armageddon, and we are looking at specialist weapons. I know some of you have been waiting for this one, looking forward to hearing more on the special rules for the guns that you can use in Epic. If you are interested in Epic Armageddon, then I suggest you check out the other videos that I've released so far going over the rules and how to play, so let's have a look. Specialist weapons. Some weapons, but not all, have special rules attached to them, making them what we consider to be specialist weapons. If they do have any special abilities, then you will find this on the data sheet in the column representing that particular weapon. So today we'll go through all the special rules that you might find on your data sheet, so that you have some idea as to what the weapon does with that ability. And it's possible to have several abilities on the one weapon, like a single shot Titan killer or an indirectly firing macro weapon. So let's get into that and learn more about these abilities so that we can understand them. Starting today is anti-aircraft weaponry. Anti-aircraft weapons are used in dogfighting or to defend against aircraft, though they can be multi-role. They have AA plus firepower value on their data sheet, and this is how you will tell that they are anti-aircraft, as it will not specifically have it listed anywhere else that they are anti-aircraft weapons. Generally, they are flexible and will have AT plus or AP plus on the weapon as well. Here is an example of a Firestorm battery. As you can see, it has a weapon with a 45 centimeter range. It receives 2 shots per unit when firing, and those shots can either be AP 5 plus, AT 5 plus, or what we are interested in is a AA 4 plus. This is an anti-aircraft attack. There will be more rules in our aerospace video as to how anti-aircraft weapons and flak attacks and everything work, so don't worry, we'll get onto that. Okay, on to disrupt weapons now. Disrupt weapons are meant to do exactly that, to disrupt enemy formations by applying more blast markers onto those formations. As such, they inflict a blast marker on any formation for every hit they score, instead of the normal rules, which is for every kill that you score. Units hit by disrupt weapons take saves as normal, and it is important to note though that casualties do not inflict a second blast marker when removed, so there's no double dipping. It's basically one blast marker for every unit that is hit. It doesn't matter how many you actually end up killing, so they're quite handy. Okay, and we have an FAQ on disrupt weapons. First one is, does a disrupt hit inflict a blast marker on an expendable unit? And the answer is no. So expendable rules override disrupt rules. So don't waste your ammunition maybe on expendable units necessarily. Next up, does a disrupt hit inflict a blast marker when it takes down a void shield or power field? And again, the answer is no. So we haven't looked at these rules, but generally any hit that doesn't cause blast markers when hitting these shields, that's the general rule for void shields, but disrupt's no different, so it won't either. Okay, disrupt hit destroys a transport unit carrying other units. Do these units count as being hit by the disrupt hit? It's a good question, and no. Note that blast markers should still be placed if the transported units are destroyed, however. So a fair and balanced way of working it out, I think. You still get to apply the disrupt blast markers, but also the casualty blast markers as well. Okay, extra attack weapons now. And this is quite a common special ability that you will come across in Epic Armageddon. So pay attention, particularly to the FAQs that will come after this. Some assault and close combat weapons have extra attacks plus X in brackets. This denotes that the unit receives plus X additional attacks. So if maths isn't your strong point, the X just stands for a number, and that is the number of extra attacks. So it could be a +2, which would mean 2 additional attacks. Sometimes it's actually got a dice roll next to these weapons. So a plus D3, for example, would give you an extra D3 roll of extra attack. So it could be 1, 2, or 3, depending on what you roll. Extra attacks can apply to shooting, close combat, and firefight attacks, and allow you to make that many additional attacks as you might expect. But that's nice and simple, but the questions that arise from it: how do special abilities apply to a weapon with an extra attack? Special abilities, unit or weapon, that are on a weapon with extra attacks apply to and only to the extra attacks. All special weapon abilities, such as First Strike, on the unit are also inherited by the extra attacks, but special unit abilities, for example sniper, that are on the unit are not. Okay, so the first FAQ here is an important one to understand how extra attacks work. Any special abilities on the weapon apply only to the extra additional attacks, not the normal attacks you usually get. This is mainly seen in assault. You get a lot of macro weapon extra attack weapons, which means macro weapon, the special ability, is only on the extra attacks. However, as it says, any special weapon ability on the unit, that is the rules that you find in this video and the section of the rules, are inherited by the extra attacks. So first strike unit, a unit with first strike that is, applies a first strike to all attacks. But any special unit abilities, that's rules from our last two videos on specialist units, are not on the extra attack, just on their base attack. And the example is sniper. So sniper is not a specialist weapon. That's actually one of our specialist units special rules. Gets a bit tricky, but just try and remember some of this stuff, but it takes time to get it. And it's important not to give all attacks the abilities unless they should have it. Otherwise, they can be a lot better than they should be. Most of the time you will see macro weapon extra attacks, and the easy way to remember it is the macro weapon ability just goes on the extra attacks, not the base attack that you get. All right, next question. If a unit has an extra attack on small arms weapon, can it be used if the unit is in base contact with the enemy? And the answer is only if the unit is a war engine, and that can only be allocated to units in firefight with the war engine. So extra attacks on small arms cannot be used if in base to base unless you're a war engine, and we'll look at war engines in our next video. So it's a good little tactic if someone's got extra attacks on a small arms weapon. If you can get them in base contact in an assault, they will lose those attacks. Okay, first strike. This can be a very powerful ability. Weapons with first strike make attacks before other weapons, and you'll find this relevant in assaults, obviously. You resolve attack and inflict damage before enemy units make their attacks. This can mean that enemy units are destroyed before they can attack you. So this is a great way to remove the opportunity for units to even fight in an assault. It's very nasty indeed. So a few more rules on first strike. So recalling our extra attack FAQs firstly, if the ability is on a weapon with extra attacks, then only the extra attacks get the first strike ability. So hopefully that makes sense with what we looked at a minute ago. Otherwise, it will apply to all attacks on either the small arms or close combat weapon. So if it's on the unit, it applies to all attacks. If it's on the weapon, it'll probably apply to the extra attacks. If both sides have first strike weapons, then resolve these attacks as normal together at the same time, and then after the first strikes happen, you remove the casualties, and then all the regular attacks get to go. Okay, some first strike FAQs. First up, a unit in base contact uses a first strike extra attack, and the enemy unit is removed. Can the unit still use its close combat value for its regular attack? And the answer is only if it was in base contact with another enemy unit. Otherwise, it would have to use its firefight value. So removing someone with a first strike doesn't stop an attack that a unit has that will resolve simultaneously. How does first strike work with supporting fire? And first strike doesn't provide a benefit in this situation. Just treat supporting fire as normal, which makes sense when you think about it. All right, on to ignore cover. These weapons negate cover, or the effects of cover, I should say, and they do this in two different ways. The first one is they ignore the -1 to hit cover modifier, which is really good, and they also negate infantry cover saves. So generally just ignore any cover effects against these particular shots. And this only applies to these weapons, not any other weapons that might be shooting at the same time. Okay, on to macro weapons. This is everyone's favorite type of weapon, and these are really devastating, hard-hitting shots, and as a result, only units with reinforced armor or invulnerable saves will receive a saving throw against macro weapons, which is really good. All other units do not receive any armor save. So macro weapons in general ignore armor saves, which is exceptionally powerful. Let's have a look at shooting attacks with macro weapons. So macro weapon attacks that do not have AP and they do not have AT listed, but instead they have MW. So you'll see it on a weapon, for example, MW2+, which means it's a macro weapon attack that hits on a 2+. When shooting, you roll to hit normally when firing. However, there are some exceptions. Targets get no armor saves, except for reinforced armor or invulnerable saves, as we just looked at. And also, cover saves are negated by macro weapons, so you don't get your cover save, but it's the -1 to hit modifier you get for cover still applies. That's important to remember, that roll to hit is still affected by cover, but they don't get that cover save. And lastly, units on a transport hit by a macro weapon will only get a save if they would save against a macro weapon normally. So if the transport is vaporized, so are all the troops inside generally, unless you have a special save. So what about macro weapons that are barrage weapons too? If this is the case, then you work out your barrage as normal. Calculating your barrage points, templates, and hitting are all done normally. So refer back to our barrages video for that. However, the change comes in that any hits that you score do not get saving throws unless they have reinforced armor or invulnerable saves. So you work out barrages as normal, but you still get that benefit of removing the armor saves. What about an assault? Well, some small arms and assault weapons that have extra attacks and macro weapons as well. The macro weapon ability applies only to the extra attacks, as we've already heard. So again, something it's familiar with all the extra weapons and the extra attacks, rules I should say, and the special abilities. Only apply the macro weapon rule to the extra attacks. Otherwise, it just makes the unit so much better if you apply to all the attacks. So just do it on that extra attack. It's, I can't say that enough. I've seen that happen before, and it makes units a lot better. All right, allocating hits from macro weapons. That happens a little bit differently to regular attacks. So when dealing with both macro weapon attacks and normal attacks, allocate and make saves against normal attacks first. So do all the normal ones first, then you allocate macro weapon hits and you make any saves if there are any to be made. So resolve all the regular damage and casualties, then apply the macro weapon hits. Hits from macro weapons can only be applied to units in a position to be hit. So work this out. After all the normal hits are resolved, see who is still left, who's in a position to be hit with the macro weapon attack. All right, time for some FAQs on macro weapons. A transport unit is destroyed, but the units being transported survive and are placed in base contact with an armored vehicle. May macro weapon hits be allocated to them? And the answer is yes. So the placement of the survivors into base contact usually affects the to hit roll needed, but it doesn't affect it here as the roll has been made simultaneously, I guess. All right. If a unit in an assault with a macro weapon attack is destroyed by a regular hit before macro weapon hits are allocated, is its macro weapon attack disregarded? And the answer is no, thankfully. All attacks in assault are simultaneous. Macro weapon hits are just allocated after regular attacks. So you can't be shortchanged by dying too quickly, or you can't shortchange someone else by killing their macro weapon guy before their hit actually is scored. It's all simultaneous. Okay, single shot weapons. These are weapons, perhaps like a missile that you fire off once. They've got a limited use in the battle, and so generally they may be used once per battle and not again. So one and done type weapons. In order to track this between different units, perhaps record which single shot weapons have been fired, as you may not fire them all at the same time. Okay, an FAQ comes out of this. Can a single shot weapon that is fired count for suppression purposes? So that's a weapon that's already fired its shot. Can it still count as suppression? And you think no, but the answer is yes. So they can still be the unit that gets suppressed even if they've shot their weapon off. It's a bit of a weird ruling, but okay, I guess we can take that. Let's move on to slow firing weapons. All right, so slow firing weapons, or slow to fire, take one turn to reload after firing. This means that if you fire on one turn, then you cannot fire in the next, as you have to basically reload. Mark in some way that you have fired that turn, and then remove that marking or that token or whatever you might be using in the next activation of the unit, just to demonstrate that you have reloaded it. can use tokens. Some people turn units around backwards while they're unable to shoot. Just some way that you want to clearly show yourself and your opponent that they have fired and they are going to have to reload. Okay, some FAQs. If a slow firing weapon's firepower is preceded by a multiplier, do all of the shots have to be used? So it could be, two-shot weapon basically. And it's saying no, shots can be saved and used during the following turn while the weapon is reloading. So you have some flexibility here. Just keep track of how many you shoot each turn and what you are waiting on to reload in the following turn. So a little bit of bookkeeping will need to be done, but it's quite flexible. Can a slow firing weapon that has fired all its shots count for suppression purposes on the turn it is reloading? So this is just like the single shot FAQ we just read before. And the answer is yes. So it can take the suppression hit for you, which is very interesting, I think. Okay, Titan killers. These are the big boys of weapons, the biggest of the biggest, essentially. Units hit by these weapons cannot take cover or armor saves against the hit, even if they have reinforced armor. So there's no saves at all, essentially. Well, for the most part. So we'll just see how that goes. But further rules apply to Titans, and we will cover all that. But in all other ways, treat them as macro weapons. So they're macro weapons, but you aren't saving a thing against these things. So quite good. Titan killers are very powerful weapons and can quite often do many wounds, but we'll have a look at that when we get into war engines. Okay, on to indirect fire, because who needs to see the enemy in order to kill them? Some barrage weapons can fire indirectly, but only when they take a sustained fire action. So you need to take that action in order to fire indirectly. If they fail their action test, they can fire as normal for their hold action, but they can't fire indirectly. So firing indirectly is only through sustained fire, and no other action that lets you shoot can do a indirect fire. Units firing this way still receive the +1 to hit modifier from sustained fire as well. So you don't lose that just because you're firing indirectly, which makes them very potent. Okay, a bit more on indirect fire. So the good thing with indirect fire is no line of fire is required and intervening terrain is ignored. So it's a way of firing without seeing the enemy. Think of an artillery piece firing over the buildings. It's a brilliant way of shooting at things in Epic. It can be quite annoying to face depending what your army is. Weapons firing indirectly also double their range. So something great to remember, the range that you see on the gun might not actually be the limit of it if it can fire indirectly. However, they have a minimum range of 30 centimeters and cannot fire at targets within this range. So if you get close enough to indirect firing units, they cannot target you. So something to remember in that, but they are great. They can let you shoot without seeing a thing. Okay, this brings us to our last FAQ for the video, and then we are finished. So that FAQ is, does a weapon firing indirectly ignore the -1 to hit modifier if the target is in cover? That's a great question, and that question will come up for you if you use indirect firing. The answer is, if the target would receive the modifier for being partially obscured, then yes, you do ignore it. If the target is in cover, then no, it would still benefit from the -1 to hit modifier. So it all depends why the unit you are firing at gets cover. So follow these guides. If they're getting cover because there's a piece of terrain that partially obscures your view of them, but they're not actually in cover, then you will ignore it, which is great. But if they're in cover, like in a forest or a building or something, then they will be receiving their -1 to hit still. Doesn't matter that it's indirect fire. Well, we made it once again to the end of another video in our Epic Armageddon series. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video and learned a lot about specialist weapons and how they work in Epic Armageddon. The next video in the series we're going to look at will be around war engines, the big lumbering machines of Epic, the cool stuff. So don't miss that. Feel free to like or subscribe if you want to see the rest of this series, and I'll try to respond to any comments that you might leave as well. See you next time on Too Many Games.